The moment Florence Bristol stepped off the stagecoach into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, 3 different men laughed out loud, and one woman shook her head so hard her bonnet nearly flew off her ears. Florence had heard them. She had heard every single one of them, and she had squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked toward the dusty, sun-bleached building that would become her schoolhouse, as though the laughter were nothing more than the wind rattling through the prairie grass. She was 24 years old. She had a teaching certificate from a school in Cincinnati, Ohio, and she had answered an advertisement in the newspaper that promised a modest salary, a small dwelling attached to the schoolhouse, and the gratitude of a community desperate for education. What the advertisement had neglected to mention was that Caldwell, Kansas, was not exactly a town that placed tremendous stock in formal education, that 3 teachers before her had departed within 6 months of arrival, and that the children who would fill her classroom were, by most accounts, as wild as the land that surrounded them. She learned all of this from Mrs. Dora Halstead, who ran the boarding house on the main road and who had appointed herself Florence's unofficial guide to the town's many disappointments. Dora was a broad woman with kind eyes and a habit of speaking truths the way other people might swing a hammer, directly and with considerable force. "The Carver boy threw a rock through the last teacher's window," Dora said, setting a plate of biscuits on the table between them on Florence's first evening. Not at the teacher, mind you, just the window, but the message was the same. Mr. Whitfield before him said the wind alone was enough to drive a person mad, said it never stopped. Miss Elaine Forsyth, she was sweet, genuinely sweet. She cried every single day for 4 months before she got on a stage heading back to St. Louis. "I am not Miss Forsyth," Florence said, reaching for a biscuit. "No," Dora agreed, studying her with those frank eyes. "You don't strike me as the crying type, but that doesn't mean you'll stay." "I will stay," Florence said. Dora smiled at that, the way a person smiles at something they find charming but don't quite believe. "We'll see, honey, we'll see." The schoolhouse was a single room built of warped timber, with a potbelly stove in the corner that smoked more than it heated, 12 desks of varying sizes crammed together without much thought to arrangement, and a blackboard that had been hung slightly crooked, so that everything written on it seemed to lean just a little to the left, as though even the arithmetic were uncertain of itself. Florence spent the entire first weekend scrubbing the floors, straightening the desks, wiping the blackboard clean, and arranging the few books she had brought with her from Cincinnati on the shelf above the window where the light was best. She nailed a small calendar to the wall. She wrote her name on the blackboard in large, careful letters, Miss Bristol. She sharpened every pencil in the tin pail she found under the teacher's desk. She lit the stove and figured out that if she opened the small flue on the left side a half turn more than felt natural, the smoke went up the chimney instead of into the room. Small victories, she told herself. Small victories would be how she won this. The first morning of school brought 11 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and every single one of them had the look of a creature deciding whether to bolt. The youngest, a girl named Clara Whitmore, sat in the front row with her hands folded and her eyes enormous. The oldest, a boy named Tom Carver, the very one who had thrown the rock through his predecessor's window, sat in the back with his arms crossed and the studied expression of someone who had already decided this was a waste of his time. "Good morning," Florence said. "My name is Miss Bristol. I have been told that several teachers before me have not lasted long in this schoolhouse." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "I want you to know that I am not going anywhere, so we might as well get started." Tom Carver snorted. She ignored him entirely, which surprised him enough that he actually uncrossed his arms. The first week was not easy. Tom Carver knocked her inkwell off her desk on the second day, an accident, he claimed, though the angle of it suggested otherwise. 2 of the younger boys spent the better part of Wednesday chasing a lizard around the room instead of practicing their letters. A girl named Mee Peterson informed Florence with complete sincerity that her father said book learning was for people who couldn't do real work, And Florence had replied, with equal sincerity, that she respected me's father but disagreed with him, and that she hoped me might form her own opinion on the matter in time. By Friday of the second week, Florence was exhausted in a way she had never been exhausted before, a bone-deep weariness that reached all the way into the center of her and squeezed. She sat at her desk after the children had gone, the late afternoon light falling golden and slanted through the single window, and she allowed herself 3 full minutes of doubt. 3 minutes of sitting with the terrible possibility that the people of Caldwell were right, that she would not last the year, that she had made a mistake leaving Cincinnati where the streets were paved, and the winters were cold but manageable, and the classrooms were made of proper brick. Then she stood up, picked up her chalk, and wrote the names of the states in alphabetical order on the blackboard because the children needed to know them, and they hadn't gotten past Missouri yet, and she was not going to let a bad 2 weeks become a reason to stop. It was during that third week, on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind had kicked up into something fierce, and the prairie grass outside the window was bent nearly horizontal, that she first encountered Samuel Donnelly. He appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse, just as Florence was sending the children home, early because the sky to the northwest had gone the particular shade of green that Dora had warned her about. "Get the children home when you see that green," Dora had said. "Don't ask questions, just get them home." Florence had trusted this advice completely and was shooing the last of them out the door when she nearly walked directly into a man's chest. She stepped back and looked up. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it had grown past the collar of his coat. He wore the clothes of a working ranch hand, worn leather boots, canvas trousers, a flannel shirt the color of a faded summer sky, and he held his hat in both hands in a way that suggested he had manners, though the look in his dark eyes suggested he was rarely in a hurry to display them. He had a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and a scar along his left cheekbone that looked old, well settled into the architecture of his face. Florence guessed he was somewhere near her own age, perhaps a year or 2 older. "Samuel Donnelly," he said. "I'm here for my sister." "Your sister," Florence said, stepping aside to let him see that the classroom was empty behind her. "All the children have been dismissed. There's a storm coming." "I can see that," he said. "That's why I'm here. Lily doesn't always notice the sky." Florence looked past him to the road and saw a small figure running toward the schoolhouse from the direction of the general store, a girl of about 9 with the same dark hair and the same directness in her expression as the man standing before her. Lily Donnelly arrived out of breath and grabbed her brother's arm with both hands. "I was at Mr. Carson's," Lily said. "He let me look at the new books." "I know," Samuel said, settling his hat back on his head. "Get home now, Lily, storm's coming." He glanced at Florence once more, a brief, assessing sort of glance, and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Then he turned and walked away with his sister into the rising wind, and Florence watched them go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before stepping back inside to latch the shutters. She thought nothing more of it that evening, occupied as she was with securing the schoolhouse against the storm, and then sitting in her small attached room listening to the wind howl around the eaves like something alive and angry. But she thought about him the next morning, when Lily Donnelly came into school with her slate under her arm, and a careful, watchful quality that Florence had noticed before but now recognized as the look of a child who paid close attention to everything and trusted very few people. "Your brother," Florence said, during the midday break when the others had gone outside and Lily had stayed to finish an arithmetic problem. "He works on a ranch." "The Hendricks spread," Lily said without looking up from her slate. "Has for 3 years. Before that we were in Wichita." She paused. "Our parents died of fever. Sam took care of me." Florence felt the words land in the quiet room with all their weight. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Lily looked up then, and something in her expression shifted slightly, as though she had expected something different and found Florence's directness a relief. "Sam says school matters," Lily said. He never got to finish his own. He makes me come every single day. He sounds like a good brother." "He is," Lily said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "He's the best person I know." Florence let that sit between them and said nothing more about it. But she found herself watching for Samuel Donnelly after that, noticing when he rode past the schoolhouse on the road to town, noticing when he stopped at the general store on Saturdays, while Lily came to browse the small lending library that Florence had arranged with Mr. Carson, the store owner, as a way to keep the children reading through the weekends. She noticed the way he moved through the town, which was to say with a kind of deliberate, unhurried competence, never quite part of the noise and motion of the main road, but never entirely removed from it either. He noticed her noticing. She was fairly certain of that, because twice he had looked across the road and caught her eye and held it for just a second before turning away, and that second was enough to make something in her chest feel very different from what she was used to. It was Dora Halstead who told her Samuel Donnelly's story in the fullness of it, as they sat on Dora's porch one October evening with cups of coffee and the particular companionship that develops between two women who respect each other. "Sam Donnelly came to Caldwell about a year before you did," Dora said. "He and his sister came together. He'd been working cattle drives up from Texas before that, and before that a few other things that he doesn't talk about much. He's quiet, Sam is. Decent man, everyone agrees on that, even the ones who don't like him much." "Who doesn't like him?" Florence asked. "Ray Hendricks, the man he works for, likes him fine, but some of the other men in town think he has opinions above his station. Sam reads, you see. He borrows books from Mr. Carson just like little Lily does. Some men find that unsettling in a ranch hand." Florence thought about this. "That seems like a poor reason to dislike a person." "Most reasons for disliking a person are poor reasons," Dora said dryly. "The better question is why he reads. And the reason is he's sharp as a whip, Florence, always has been from what people say, but he grew up poor as stones and never had the schooling for it. He can read well enough now, taught himself the rest of what he needed, but it took him years. He told me once, and this is the only time I've ever heard him say anything even close to personal, that the thing he regretted most in his life was not getting an education when he was young enough to have one easily." Florence set down her coffee cup. She thought about Lily's words. "Sam says school matters. He never got to finish his own." "He's a good man," Dora continued. "Lonely, I think. This isn't a town that makes it easy for a person to be thoughtful and quiet. Too much noise here, too much rough business, but he stays because of Lily." "He stays because of Lily," Florence repeated softly. "And Lily," Dora said with the faintest smile, "stays because of school. So in a roundabout way, you might say Sam Donnelly is staying in Caldwell because of a schoolteacher." Florence picked her coffee cup back up and said nothing, but the warmth that moved through her was not entirely from the coffee. The first real conversation she had with Samuel Donnelly happened in November, on a morning that was cold enough to make the puddles in the road crackle at the edges. She was on her way to the general store to purchase a new box of chalk and a bottle of ink, and he was coming out of the store at the same moment she was going in, and they nearly collided on the steps for the second time. "Miss Bristol," he said, steadying himself and stepping aside. "Mr. Donnelly," she said, "we seem to keep nearly walking into each other." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. "Seems so," he said. She expected him to tip his hat and move on, as he always did, but he didn't. He stood on the step for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in that way he had, and looked at her with those dark eyes that were so much more alert than his general quietness suggested. "Lily showed me the letter she wrote," he said finally. "The one about the river she imagines." Florence had assigned the children the task of writing about a place they had never been but wished to visit, and Lily Donnelly had written 3 full pages in her careful handwriting about a wide green river with trees hanging over it and fish that flashed silver in the current. It had been the best piece of writing Florence had seen from any of the children. "She's extraordinarily talented," Florence said. "She has a genuine gift with words." "I know," he said, and the pride in his voice was so unguarded, so entirely honest, that Florence felt something shift between them, the careful distance of strangers collapsing slightly. "She gets it from reading. You've made her want to read more than she already did, and she already read more than most grown people I know." "She'll go far," Florence said, "if she keeps at it." "She will," he said. "I'll make sure of it." There was a brief silence in which the cold morning air moved between them and the sounds of the town carried on in the background, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a dog barking somewhere on the far side of the main road, the creak of a wagon passing by. "I hear you've been having some trouble with Tom Carver," he said. Florence raised an eyebrow. "News travels." "In a small town, everything travels." He looked at her steadily. "You're not running, though." "No," she said. "I'm not." That almost smile moved through his expression again. "That's something," he said. He put his hat on, touched 2 fingers to the brim, and stepped past her down toward the road. Florence stood on the steps of the general store for a moment longer than necessary, watching him go, and then went inside to buy her chalk. December arrived with the full weight of a Kansas winter, the kind of cold that made the schoolhouse stove absolutely essential, and made Florence extraordinarily grateful for the lesson she had learned early about the flu. She had taken to arriving at the schoolhouse 30 minutes before the children each morning to get the stove going, so that the room was warm by the time they came in, stomping their boots and breathing clouds of visible breath. On a Monday morning in early December, she arrived to find wood stacked neatly beside the schoolhouse door. She stopped and looked at it for a moment, puzzled, because the existing pile had been running low and she had planned to speak with the town council about replenishing it. This new stack was substantial, precisely cut and well stacked, and had not been there the previous Friday when she had left. She asked Dora about it that evening. Dora smiled and said nothing immediately, which was very unlike Dora. "I might ask around," was all she said. Florence asked Mr. Carson at the general store. He shrugged elaborately, which was its own kind of answer. She asked the school board chairman, Mr. Abernathy, and he said he hadn't authorized any wood delivery but supposed he ought to, and promised to look into it for the spring. It was Lily who told her, eventually, not meaning to. It slipped out on a Thursday afternoon when Lily was helping Florence organize the bookshelf, a task she had volunteered for with the enthusiasm of someone handling treasure. "Sam was up very early on Sunday," Lily said casually, reaching for a book. "He borrowed Mr. Hendrick's axe." Florence looked at her. Lily kept her eyes on the books. "Did he?" Florence said. "He worries the stove won't keep you warm enough," Lily said. "He doesn't say so, but he worries." Florence stood very still for a moment, the chalk in her hand, looking at the small girl who was very deliberately not looking at her. She thought about a man who had taught himself to read because no one had taught him properly when he was young, who kept his sister in school with the dedicated commitment of someone redeeming something, who stacked firewood in the dark on a Sunday morning for a schoolteacher he had barely spoken to. "Tell your brother," she said carefully, "that I am grateful." Lily looked at her then with that direct, assessing gaze that was so like her brother's, and smiled. It was a small, private smile, the smile of someone who knows something. The winter school social was an event that the town had held, apparently, for as long as anyone could remember, and it took place in the church hall on the second Friday of December. Florence was expected to attend, as the schoolteacher, and to organize a brief performance by the children, which she accomplished by having them recite poems they had memorized and Clara Whitmore playing a simple tune on the church organ. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool with small ivory buttons at the cuffs, and she pinned her hair up with more care than she usually took, and she arrived at the church hall to find it strung with paper lanterns and crowded with most of Caldwell's population, which was to say somewhere between 60 and 80 people, all of them talking at once. She navigated her way through the crowd, accepting compliments on the children's recitations. Tom Carver had surprised everyone, including apparently himself, by delivering his poem with something approaching feeling, and deflecting the questions about whether she planned to return next year that seemed to be the social equivalent of a test she was always being asked to take. "Of course I plan to return," she told Mrs. Hendricks, who had asked with the politely skeptical air of someone who had seen teachers come and go. "I've hardly gotten started." "We've had teachers say that before," Mrs. Hendricks said. "With respect, Mrs. Hendricks, I am not those teachers." She turned from this conversation and nearly walked, for the third time in her acquaintance with Caldwell, into Samuel Donnelly. He caught her by the arm to steady her, a light, brief contact, and released her immediately. He had cleaned up considerably from his usual working appearance. His hair was neat. His shirt was white. His boots had been polished, and he looked, Florence thought in the half-second before she remembered herself, remarkably like a man in a painting. "We have to stop meeting this way," she said, because it was the third time and she couldn't not say it. "Maybe we should try meeting on purpose," he said. It was the most he had ever said to her in one go, and the directness of it surprised her enough that she didn't immediately respond, which was itself unlike her. She looked at him and he looked at her, and around them the church hall noise continued and the paper lantern swayed slightly in the warm air from the hearth. "I want to thank you," she said, recovering herself, "for the wood. It was nothing." "It was not nothing," she said. "It was considerable and it was kind, and I want you to know that it was noticed and appreciated." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away briefly, a slight tension moving through his jaw. "A teacher shouldn't have to chop her own wood," he said. "And the school board around here is useless as a screen door on a submarine." Florence laughed, genuinely and fully, and the surprise of it seemed to catch him off guard, because he looked back at her and something in his expression opened up in a way it hadn't before. "May I get you something to drink?" he asked. "You may," she said. They spent the next hour standing near the edge of the room, talking in the way that people talk when they have been separately waiting for the opportunity, and are surprised to find how easily it comes. He told her about Kansas, about the quality of the light in spring, about the way the cattle drives had been in the years before the railroads changed everything, about the particular smell of rain on prairie grass. She told him about Cincinnati, about the school where she had trained, about the bookshop near her apartment where she had spent every Saturday afternoon for 3 years, about the exact moment she had seen the advertisement for a teacher in Caldwell and felt something in her chest say yes before her mind had fully read to the end of it. "Why yes?" he asked. "Most people see Kansas and say the opposite." "I wanted something real," she said. "Cincinnati is a fine city. It's very comfortable, but I had the feeling that I was living inside a very well-made box, and that somewhere there was something larger and I wasn't going to find it staying comfortable." He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly in his hands. "I know that feeling," he said. "Do you? The drive to keep moving. The sense that there's something you're supposed to be doing that you haven't found yet." He glanced at Lily across the room, who was helping Clara Whitmore with a plate of food. "I found part of it when I had to take care of her, but not all of it." The conversation paused there, held in a kind of careful balance, and then someone called for a reel and the fiddle started up, and the moment passed into the general movement of the evening. But Florence carried it home with her, that conversation, turning it over and examining it the way she might turn over an interesting stone found on the road. January was hard in the way that Kansas Januaries are hard, which is to say brutally, without apology, with a cold that made the very air feel brittle. Florence lost 3 students temporarily during the worst weeks when families couldn't spare children from helping at home, and she sent lessons home with any child who passed by, a habit that earned her a grudging respect from some of the parents who had expected her to either give up or lower her standards. She did neither. Samuel came to speak with her in the second week of January, on a Saturday morning when the school was empty, but Florence was there anyway, mending the spine of a worn reader with a careful application of glue and patience. He knocked on the open door and she looked up and said, "Come in," without thinking, and he came in and stood in the middle of the room looking at the desks and the books and the crooked blackboard with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Lily says you've been sending lessons home," he said. "The children shouldn't lose the thread just because the weather is difficult." "No," he agreed. "They shouldn't." He looked at the blackboard. "She also says you've been teaching them about the history of the country, about what happened with the land." Florence set down her book in glue and looked at him directly. She had, in fact, spent considerable time in the past weeks teaching the children an honest history of Kansas, which included the treaties that had been made and broken with the native peoples, the Osage and the Kansa and others, whose land this had been before it was anything else. It was not the sanitized version of history, and she was aware that some of the parents had opinions about her choice. She had taught it anyway because the truth of a thing mattered, and because children deserved the truth even when it was complicated. "Yes," she said, "I believe children should know honest history." He held her gaze with something in his eyes that she was starting to recognize as the look he had when something moved him and he was deciding whether to say so. "That's a brave thing in this town," he said. "Some of these men have opinions about who this land belongs to." "History doesn't care about opinions," she said. "It just keeps being what it was." A long silence stretched out in the cold schoolroom, the stove crackling quietly between them, the winter light flat and white through the window. "I found something in your lending library last month," he said, and she could tell that he was shifting the conversation deliberately, carefully, to something different. "A collection of poems." "Whitman, Leaves of Grass," she said. "Carson got a copy in with the last supply order. I thought someone might pick it up." "I've read it twice," he said. "I'd like to read it a third time if no one else has taken it." "It's yours for as long as you need it," she said. He nodded, and that was all, and he left. But the air in the room seemed warmer after, and Florence sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and the Mendied reader drying on the desk, and thought very carefully about what was happening to her, and whether it was wise, and decided that it did not particularly matter whether it was wise because some things simply were. February brought a thaw, brief and deceptive, and followed by another hard freeze that killed the early crocus Florence had optimistically planted beside her door. It also brought Valentine's Day, which Florence marked in the classroom by having the children write simple letters, to family members, to friends, to anyone they wished, as a lesson in expressing affection with words. Tom Carver, who had slowly and not entirely willingly transformed from Florence's most resistant student into something approaching a willing participant, wrote his letter to his grandmother in Missouri. Clara Whitmore wrote hers to her mother. Lily Donnelly wrote hers to her brother, which made Florence's chest ache with something sweet and complicated. At the end of the school day, Florence found on her desk a folded piece of paper. No envelope, no adornment, just a folded piece of ordinary paper. She waited until all the children had gone before she opened it. It said, in handwriting that was careful and strong and slightly unpracticed in its formality, "I am grateful every day that you did not leave when everyone expected you to. The children are better for you being here. I am better for knowing you." It was not signed, but she knew. She held the paper for a long time, looking at the handwriting, at the careful straightness of the lines on a page with no lines to guide them. Then she folded it back along its creases and put it inside the cover of the book she was currently reading, where it stayed for the next 12 years. She did not see him for nearly 2 weeks after that, because a fence came down at the Hendricks spread in the freeze, and the repair work kept all the hands occupied day and night, or so Lily reported. But on the first Saturday of March, when the air had finally decided to commit to the idea of spring, Florence went for a walk along the creek bed at the edge of town, where the cottonwood trees were just beginning to think about their leaves, and she found him there. He was sitting on a large flat rock with the Whitman book open in his hands, and he looked up when he heard her boots on the dried grass, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the creek ran between its banks and the cottonwoods murmured overhead, and the sky above them was the particular pale blue of early Kansas spring. "I didn't know this was your spot," she said. "I didn't know it was yours," he said. She sat down on the far end of the flat rock, a careful and respectable distance from him, and they both looked at the creek for a while. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the note." "It was true," he said simply. "I know," she said. "That's why it meant what it did." The creek moved between them, and the silence was not awkward but full, the kind of silence that happens between people who are comfortable enough with each other to let it exist. A red-winged blackbird landed on a branch above them and sang its particular creek-end whistle song and flew away. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When you came to find Lily the first day, the storm day, did you know who I was?" He was quiet for a moment. Dora had mentioned the new teacher, said she was from Cincinnati. He paused, said she hadn't left yet. And I was curious," he said, "about a person who would come to Caldwell from Cincinnati on purpose and stay when people expected her not to." He turned slightly to look at her, and the full steadiness of his gaze was something she was still learning to be brave about, because it was so entirely honest that it demanded equal honesty in return. "I've been curious about you since before we spoke. I've been curious about you since before we spoke," she said. A long moment settled over them, carrying everything those words meant. "I'm not a man with much to offer," he said, and his voice was careful now, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this particular truth many times. "I work a ranch that isn't mine. I've got a sister to keep and not much else. I have not had an easy life, and some of it has left marks I won't pretend aren't there." "Samuel," she said quietly. He stopped. "I teach children to read and write in a schoolhouse where the blackboard hangs crooked and the stove smokes, and 3 teachers before me left. I came to Kansas from Cincinnati on purpose, alone, at 24 years old, with a suitcase and a teaching certificate, and the conviction that something real was out here." She looked at him directly. "I'm not interested in easy." Something happened in his face that she had never seen there before, a kind of undoing, as though a very long tension had released all at once. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat by the creek with their hands together while the spring morning moved around them, and that was the beginning of it, the real beginning, the one that counted. Spring in Caldwell turned out to be as beautiful as the winter had been harsh. The prairie grass came up green and impossibly vivid, and the wildflowers that scattered themselves across the flat land seemed to be making a point, as though the earth were trying to compensate for the months it had spent under frost. Florence walked to school each morning through all of it, and thought that she understood now why the advertisement had said what it said about the land, why a person would come out here and stay despite everything. She and Samuel walked together on Saturday and Sunday mornings, usually along the creek but sometimes out into the open prairie, where the horizon sat so far away it seemed theoretical. They talked without stopping and also without effort, covering everything from the books they were reading to their memories of being children to their opinions on the direction the country was going, to the specific quality of the light at different hours of the day. He had a mind that was quick and precise and deeply curious, all the more interesting for its lack of formal education, because everything he knew he had gotten through his own effort, and it showed in the way he held ideas carefully, with the attentiveness of someone who had paid full price for them. She brought him books. He brought her things he found on the prairie, interesting stones, once a perfectly preserved hawk feather, once a small wildflower pressed flat inside a piece of brown paper that he handed to her without commentary while they were walking, and that she put in the same book where she kept his note. The town noticed, of course. Small towns notice everything, and Caldwell was small enough that a man and a woman who took Saturday morning walks were as good as engaged in the eyes of most people, which created a different kind of problem than the ones Florence had faced in the fall. Mrs. Abernathy, wife of the school board chairman, took Florence aside after church on a Sunday in late April and informed her, with the tight-lipped concern of someone who sincerely believed she was doing a kindness, that it was not entirely appropriate for the schoolteacher to be seen keeping company with a ranch hand, and that some members of the school board had expressed concern. Florence looked at Mrs. Abernathy for a long, level moment. Mr. Donnelly is a man of good character, she said. He is educating himself. He cares for his sister with exceptional devotion, and he has shown me more genuine respect and intelligence than most of the people in this town who would judge him. I am not interested in appearances, Mrs. Abernathy. I am interested in character. Mrs. Abernathy looked somewhat taken aback. Florence thanked her for her concern, excused herself, and walked out into the Sunday morning feeling very clear and very certain. She told Samuel about it on their next walk, because she was not the kind of person who kept things hidden, and because she wanted to see how he responded. "Abernathy's wife," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, just a kind of weary recognition. "She said worse to me directly, told me once that a man in my position should mind what he reaches for." "Man in your position," Florence repeated, feeling a heat rise in her chest that was not entirely comfortable. What an extraordinarily rude thing to say. She meant it as advice. "Advice is only advice when it's asked for," Florence said. "Otherwise it's just judgment wrapped in concern." He looked at her with that expression, the one that was almost a smile and something more besides, and said, "Is that one of the things they teach you in Cincinnati?" "It's one of the things my mother taught me," she said. She was a woman who had no patience for judgment dressed as concern. "She would have liked you very much, I think." He was quiet for a moment at that. Then softly, "Tell me about her." And Florence did, walking through the spring prairie with his hand warm around hers, telling him about her mother, who had died 4 years earlier, and whom she still missed every single day, who had been a sharp-tongued, generous woman who believed that education was the most powerful thing a person could have, who had pushed Florence toward teaching with the force of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She talked until she had said everything, until the words ran out and the silence that replaced them was gentle and warm and held. "I think she did the right thing," Samuel said, "pushing you toward teaching." Florence squeezed his hand and did not say anything, because everything was already said. In June, school let out for the summer, and Florence found herself more at liberty than she had been all year. She spent time with Dora, who had become a genuine friend, and she helped Mr. Carson organize the lending library, and she wrote long letters back to Cincinnati, to her friend Martha, who still lived there, and who wrote back with the breathless urgency of someone living vicariously through another person's adventure. And she spent time with Samuel, more time than the school year had allowed, longer walks and evenings on Dora's porch, and an afternoon in late June when he took her on horseback out to a part of the Hendricks property that was not being worked, a rise in the land that gave a view of the whole of the surrounding country for what seemed like miles in every direction. She had ridden horses before, not well, and he had been patient about it in the way he was patient about most things that required patience, which was to say, without making her feel the patience, without letting it become condescension. He had simply ridden beside her and talked about other things and let her find her seat at her own pace. When they reached the top of the rise, she understood immediately why he had brought her. The land below them was spread out in every direction, the grass rippling in the afternoon breeze in long waves of green and gold, the sky above them enormous and full of the kind of clouds that look like they have opinions. In the far distance, a line of dark trees marked the creek, and beyond that the faint suggestion of the town, and beyond that more grass, more sky, more of this country that went on and on and on. "This," she said without preamble. "Yes," he said. "This is what I came for," she said. "This is what I felt was out here." He was sitting on his horse beside her, and he was looking at her rather than the view, and when she turned to look at him his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open in a way that required a kind of courage. "Florence," he said. She met his eyes and held them. "I have been thinking about the future," he said, with the careful precision of a man who is choosing every word deliberately. "About whether a man like me, in the position I'm in, has the right to ask a woman like you for more than friendship." "Samuel Donnelly," she said, with a firmness that was also entirely gentle, "if you are about to apologize for your circumstances again, I am going to become impatient with you, and I am not generally an impatient person. I'm not apologizing, he said. I'm telling you that I love you. The wind moved through the grass below them with a long, soft sound, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out once sharply, and the afternoon light fell golden and warm over all of it. I love you too, Florence said. I have loved you, I think, since you stacked that wood by my schoolhouse door on a dark Sunday morning and said it was nothing. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they stayed on the rise above the prairie for a long time, longer than was practical. But it was summer and there was no school tomorrow, and the view was worth it. The proposal happened in October, on the anniversary of the day she had first arrived in Caldwell. Florence had told him, somewhat inadvertently, that the date was significant to her 1 full year. She had said, "And I am still here," which feels like something to mark. And so when he appeared at the schoolhouse door on that October afternoon with his hat in his hands and a look of very controlled nervousness, she knew something was happening before he said a word. The children had gone home. The afternoon light slanted through the window. The potbelly stove made its comfortable ticking sounds. He came and stood in the middle of the room, the same spot where he had stood in January looking at the blackboard, and she came around from behind her desk and stood near him, close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands turned the brim of his hat between them. "I have been saving money," he said, "for 3 years working for Hendricks. There's a parcel of land about 5 miles east of town, 160 acres, water rights attached, good grazing land. The owner is willing to sell and I can afford it by spring if I work through the winter." Florence said nothing, watching him carefully. "I want to raise cattle," he said, "my own on my own land. I've learned enough working for Hendricks to do it properly, and I want—" He stopped and started again more simply. "I want to do it with you. I want to build a house on that land, and I want you to teach school in Caldwell for as long as you want to, and I want Lily to go to proper school somewhere good when the time comes, and I want—" He stopped again and looked at her with everything plain in his face. "I want to make a life with you, a real one, if you'll have me." Florence crossed the small distance between them and took his face in her hands, and he stood very still, with his hat still in one hand and his eyes on hers. "Yes," she said. "Samuel Donnelly, the answer is yes, and it has been yes for quite some time, and I hope you understand that you have kept me in considerable suspense." He exhaled, a long, slow breath, and then he laughed, which was not something she heard from him often and which was therefore extraordinary, warm and real and unguarded. They were married the following March, in the church in Caldwell, with Dora Halstead standing up for Florence and Ray Hendricks standing up for Samuel, and Lily Donnelly sitting in the front pew with Clara Whitmore beside her, and both of them crying happily in the way that young girls cry at weddings. Mr. Carson had put a small notice in the weekly newspaper. Mrs. Abernathy attended and sat near the back and had the grace to look genuinely moved during the vows. Florence wore her dark blue wool dress with the ivory buttons, because it was still cold in March, and also because it was the dress she had worn the night of the winter social, the night they had really talked for the first time, and that mattered to her. Samuel looked like himself, which was the best possible thing she could say, which was to say steady and present and entirely real, with his good white shirt and his hair neat, and his dark eyes on hers all through the ceremony with an expression that she knew now, after months of learning his expressions, was the one he had when he was feeling something so deeply that words were entirely inadequate. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Samuel took her face in his hands the way she had taken his that afternoon in the schoolhouse, and kissed her with a gentleness that was also entirely certain. And around them the small congregation of Caldwell, Kansas, applauded, and Lily cried harder and Dora laughed with something that sounded very much like relief. They moved into a small house in town that they rented from Mr. Carson, while the work on the land progressed. The purchase of the 160 acres east of town went through in April, and Samuel began the work of fencing and clearing, and arranging the beginning infrastructure of a working ranch, with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. He brought Florence out to the land every Sunday, and she watched it take shape with the particular pleasure of watching something real be built. Florence continued teaching. The school board renewed her contract for a second year, and then a third, and each renewal was done with less of the doubtful qualification of the first year, when it had been offered in the tone of a surprise. She was, by the end of her third year, simply the schoolteacher, which was the best possible designation. Not the teacher who might leave, not the teacher from Cincinnati, not the teacher who surprised everyone by staying. Just the teacher. Tom Carver, who had thrown a rock through his predecessor's window, finished school at 14 and went to work with his father, but carried away from Florence's classroom the ability to read anything he chose, which he did, quietly, for the rest of his life. Clara Whitmore grew into a serious and intelligent young woman, who later became a schoolteacher herself in a town 2 counties over. Lily Donnelly, at 15, was accepted to a boarding school in Topeka on the strength of the writing she submitted as part of the application, writing that Florence had fostered and pushed and refused to let be less than its absolute best. The day that acceptance letter arrived, Samuel read it at the kitchen table and then sat quietly for a long moment with the letter in his hands, and Florence put her hands on his shoulders from behind and felt him breathe through the emotion of it. "She's going to be remarkable," Florence said softly. "She already is," he said. Then, after a moment, "You made her believe she could be." "She made herself believe it," Florence said. "I just refused to let her think otherwise." He turned and looked at her over his shoulder. "Same thing," he said. In the autumn of their third year of marriage, Florence discovered she was expecting a child, a fact she determined with a combination of certainty and the practical assessment of her own body that she had always trusted. She told Samuel on a Sunday morning in October, on the rise of land above their growing property where they still went sometimes to look at the view. And he was very quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something large was happening inside him. Then he turned to her and she saw on the face of a man who had been careful and guarded and self-contained through most of his life, something entirely open, a happiness so complete and so honest that it nearly broke her heart with the goodness of it. "Florence," was all he managed. "I know," she said. Their son was born in the late spring of 1882, on a clear morning when the prairie was in full bloom, and the air coming through the open window smelled of grass and wildflower, and all the good things of a Kansas May. He was a healthy, loud, vigorous infant with his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin, and they named him Thomas Henry Donnelly, Thomas for no particular reason except that it felt right, and Henry for Florence's father, who had died when she was 12, and whom she had loved with a simple, uncomplicated love that she wanted to honor. Lily came home from Topeka for the birth, and held her nephew with an expression of complete wonder, and Samuel watched. His sister hold his son, and Florence watched Samuel, and thought that whatever the distance was between the man who had arrived in Caldwell with nothing but his sister and his determination, and the man who was standing in this room in the house they had built on the land he owned with his wife and his child, that distance was everything, and they had crossed it together. Samuel's ranch took 4 full years to become what he had envisioned, which was to say a properly operating cattle operation of modest but genuine success, with 30 head in the first year growing to over 100 by the 5th. He hired 2 men to help in the 4th year, both of them younger than him, and both of them, Florence noted, the kind of men he had been when he first came to Caldwell, competent and quiet and reaching for something. He was a fair employer, which she had expected, and a better rancher than he had initially dared to claim, which she had also expected, though she had kept that expectation to herself because he needed to prove it to himself. The town of Caldwell changed around them, as towns in Kansas were changing in the 1880s, as the wild drive years began to quiet, and the farmers came in greater numbers, and the railroads shifted, and the nature of the place softened gradually from the rough edge of the frontier toward something more settled. Florence marked these changes in the population of her classroom, noting the new family names that appeared, the children who came in from places farther east, the gradual shift in what the parents expected from education. She adapted, as she had always adapted, because the foundation of good teaching was paying attention, and Florence Bristol Donnelly had been paying attention all her life. In the summer of 1884, Lily Donnelly returned from Topeka with her schooling completed, and a letter of reference from her headmistress that described her as the most gifted student of English composition the school had seen in a decade. She was 18 years old, tall and dark-haired and direct in the manner of her brother, and she sat at Florence's kitchen table and read the letter aloud with the precision of someone who has spent years earning the right to say the words. "What next?" Florence asked when Lily set the letter down. Lily looked at her with a look that was entirely her brother's, which was to say completely steady and entirely honest. "I want to write," she said, "stories, real ones, and I want to teach, I think, while I figure out how to do that." Florence reached across the table and covered Lily's hand with her own. "Then you will write," she said, "and you will teach, and you will be extraordinary at both." Lily turned her hand over and squeezed Florence's fingers. "Sam was right," she said, "about you. What did he say?" "He said," Lily said, "that the day you didn't leave when everyone expected you to was the day he understood that people are mostly wrong about what lasts." Florence was quiet for a moment with that, feeling its weight and its warmth. "He said it about you too," she said finally. "The day you wrote those 3 pages about the Green River, he came to tell me, and I knew then that whatever else was true, I was in the right place." Little Thomas, 2 years old and comprehensively into everything, toddled into the kitchen at that moment and reached his arms up toward his aunt with the absolute confidence of a child who has never once been turned away, and Lily scooped him up and he grabbed her braid and pulled, and they were all 3 of them laughing, and outside the window the Kansas summer went on and on in its enormous golden way. The winter of 1885 brought a man named Gerald Potts through Caldwell, a man who had, Florence gathered from the careful things Samuel said, and the less careful things Dora Halstead said, once been involved in some of the rougher edges of cattle business in ways that had not been entirely honest. He had some connection to an older version of Samuel's life, the time on the drives, the years in Wichita, the time before Florence, and he appeared one evening at the ranch and knocked on the door and stood in the lamplight looking like a problem. Samuel handled it on the porch quietly, and Florence stood inside with Thomas on her hip and listened to the low voices without being able to make out words. It was not long. The man left. Samuel came back inside and latched the door with a deliberate, final sort of movement and stood for a moment with his back to her, his hand still on the latch. "Someone from before," he said. "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her, and his expression was the careful one, the one he used when he was managing something he didn't want to put on her. "Samuel," she said, shifting Thomas to her other hip, "I have been your wife for 3 years. I am not frightened of your before." "Some of it isn't pretty," he said. "I know that too," she said. "Tell me." So he told her, standing in their kitchen while Thomas fell asleep against her shoulder, about the years before Caldwell, the years when survival had sometimes required things he wasn't proud of, when the cattle drives had gone bad in ways that had put him in the company of people whose methods he had eventually refused to be part of and from whom he had walked away, all the way to Caldwell, all the way to Lily and a fresh start, and the slow, careful work of building something honest. "Gerald Potts," he said finally, "wanted to remind me that I have a history. I told him I'm aware of that and that the history ended several years ago and that I'd appreciate it if he kept walking." "Good," Florence said. "Just good." He looked at her with a slight uncertainty that was the most vulnerable she ever saw him. "Samuel," she said, completely seriously, "you have spent every single day since I've known you being one of the most decent and honest people in this county." A past that you walked away from before I ever met you does not alter a thing about who you are now. Potts can keep walking." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze without flinching. Then he crossed the room and put his arms around her and the sleeping Thomas between them, and she felt his breath release against her hair. "I don't deserve you," he said very quietly. "You absolutely do," she said. "And also, you're going to wake the baby." He laughed softly and held her tighter. Gerald Potts rode out of Caldwell the following morning and was not seen again, and that particular thread of the past was closed off as cleanly as a door being shut. Florence's 6th year of teaching brought the largest class she had ever had, 14 children, the result of 3 new families settling in the area on the strength of the railroad expansion and the promise of farmland. The schoolhouse was, by this point, genuinely too small, a problem she had been noting in her annual report to the school board for 2 years, and which they had been noting back to her with polite regret and insufficient action. In the spring of 1886, she went to the school board meeting with Samuel beside her and a written proposal in her hand, and laid out, with the systematic precision of someone who has been planning a campaign, the case for a new, larger schoolhouse. She had figures which she had gathered herself. She had a proposed location, a parcel of town land adjacent to the church that was not being used for anything. She had a cost estimate, which Ray Hendricks had helped Samuel prepare, and which was lower than the board had feared because Samuel had spoken to 3 local men willing to contribute their labor in exchange for a reduced price on the lumber. Mr. Abernathy, who had become considerably more respectful of Florence over the years, looked at the proposal and then looked at Florence and said, "Miss Bristol." "Mrs. Donnelly," Florence said pleasantly. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, with the slight embarrassment of a man who has been making this correction for 2 years and keeps forgetting. "This is very thorough." "Thank you," she said. The new schoolhouse was built in the summer of 1886 and opened in September, a proper building with 2 rooms, a straight and well-hung blackboard, a stove that had been installed by someone who understood flues, and enough desks for 20 children. Florence stood in the doorway of it on the morning before the first day and felt a satisfaction that was physical, warm and solid in her chest. Samuel came to find her there, walking over from the ranch in the early morning because he knew she would be there. He stood beside her in the doorway and they looked at the new schoolroom together. "When you got off the stagecoach," he said, and everyone laughed. "You heard about that." 3 different people told me 3 different ways," he said. "Dora told it like a compliment. Mrs. Abernathy told it like a cautionary tale. Tom Carver Sr. told it like the punch line of a joke." Florence smiled. "And how do you tell it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the schoolroom, at the clean blackboard and the straight rows of desks, and the morning light coming in through windows that were properly glazed and properly hung. "I tell it as the beginning of a story," he said. "The one I'm most grateful to be part of." She turned and looked at him. This man she had built a life with, who stacked wood for her before she knew his name, who left her a note with no signature and trusted her to know, who had given her a son and a piece of land and 12 years of mornings, who read every book she gave him and gave her back better conversations than she had found anywhere else in the world, whose sister was out in the world making something extraordinary of herself, who had taken all the rough, difficult material of his life and made from it something decent and real and lasting. "Samuel," she said, "yes, I am extraordinarily glad I did not get back on that stagecoach." He smiled fully, the way she could still make him smile after all this time, the way that always felt like seeing the sun come out from behind a long cloud. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse she had fought for and built, and the school year that was about to begin stretched out before them on the September morning, full and bright and ready. The years that followed built themselves one upon another, with the accumulated weight of a life truly lived. Thomas grew into a child who was all his father's steadiness and all his mother's curiosity, a combination that expressed itself in an insatiable desire to know how everything worked, from the mechanics of the ranch to the grammar of whatever book Florence was currently teaching from. By the time he was 7, he was reading above his grade, which Florence noted with professional satisfaction and maternal smugness in equal measure. In the autumn of 1888, Florence found herself expecting again, and this time she told Samuel not on the rise above the property, but at the kitchen table over supper, in the ordinary light of the evening, because this was their life, now extraordinary things happening in ordinary moments, which was as it should be. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1889, 7 years after Thomas, born with Florence's coloring and what Samuel said were his grandmother's hands, small and perfectly shaped, with an authority in them that suggested she would use them to accomplish considerable things. They named her Margaret Jane Donnelly, Margaret for no one in particular and Jane for Dora Halstead, whose given name was Jane Dora and who had been Florence's first and most steadfast friend in Caldwell. Dora came to hold the baby on the second day and sat in Florence's kitchen chair and looked down at the infant's face for a long time without speaking. "You were supposed to not last the year," Dora said finally. Florence laughed from the bed where she was recovering. "So I've been told." "I didn't think you'd last," Dora said, with her characteristic directness. "I liked you immediately, but I didn't think you'd last. I'd seen too many of the others." She looked up from the baby to Florence. "I was wrong." "Yes," Florence said, "you were." "Don't be smug about it," Dora said. "I reserve the right to be exactly as smug as I like," Florence said. "I believe I've earned it." Dora laughed and looked back down at Margaret Jane, who was asleep and entirely imperious about it, and the afternoon light fell warm through the window, and Thomas came in from outside with mud on his boots and was loudly corrected by his father in the next room. And Caldwell, Kansas went on about its business in the way that small towns do, indifferent and full of life all at once. Lily Donnelly, by 1890, had published 3 pieces of writing in a magazine out of Chicago, pieces that were by turns funny and sharp and deeply felt, and the letters she wrote home described a life in the city that was busy and strange and full of possibility. She wrote to Florence separately from her letters to Samuel, long letters full of observations and questions, and the particular breathless quality of someone who is discovering that the world is even larger than the books suggested. Florence wrote back in the same spirit, with news of the schoolhouse and the children and the ranch, with questions of her own, with the kind of friendship that had grown between 2 women who had both been shaped by the same unusual circumstances, and had emerged from them stronger than either could have predicted. Florence had been teaching in Caldwell for 12 years when the day came that she sat on the schoolhouse steps in the late afternoon of a September day, and watched the sun go down over the prairie in its long, slow manner, and thought about 12 years. 12 years since the stagecoach. 12 years since the laughter and the skepticism and the crooked blackboard and the smoking stove. 12 years since the first class, which had shrunk over time and then grown again and kept growing, since Tom Carver's deliberately knocked inkwell, and Clara Whitmore's enormous eyes, and Lily Donnelly writing 3 pages about a river she had never seen. 12 years since a man had appeared in her doorway in the rising wind with his hat in his hands, looking for his sister. She heard his boots on the road before she saw him, the particular sound of Samuel's walk that she knew the way she knew her own breathing. He came along the road in the late light, done for the day at the ranch, and when he saw her sitting on the steps he changed direction and came to her. He sat beside her on the steps and they looked at the prairie together, at the grass going amber in the sunset light, at the sky performing its nightly extravagance of color above the flat line of the horizon. 12 years, she said. Yes, he said. I remember the day I arrived, she said. I remember thinking, is this really what I came for? All this sky and all this distance and all these people looking at me like I was something the cat dragged in. You didn't look like you thought that, he said. I was not going to let them see it. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, I was in Mr. Carson's store when you arrived. I heard Halstead and those others laugh. I looked out the window and watched you walk toward the schoolhouse. She looked at him. "You never told me that." "No," he said. "What did you think?" He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to anything worth thinking about. "I thought," he said slowly, "that there was a person who had made a decision and was going to live with it come what may. And I thought," he paused, "I thought I had never seen someone look like that, like they had already decided that whatever happened, they were not going to be the thing that gave way." Florence leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, the easy familiar weight of 12 years, and they watched the sun complete its descent into the Kansas horizon. "Are you glad you stayed?" he asked. The question was simple and genuine, the question of a man who always asked what he actually wanted to know. "Samuel Donnelly," she said, watching the last light fade over the prairie, feeling the warmth of his arm around her and the specific perfect rightness of this moment on the steps of the schoolhouse that had defined her life. "I am going to stay until I am old and there is no chalk left in the territory, and the children have forgotten what a book looks like. And even then I will probably find a way to keep teaching because it is what I am, and it is what I love." She turned to look at him, and his face in the fading light was so entirely known to her, so entirely dear, that her chest contracted with the completeness of it. "And I am going to stay with you until there are no more days left to stay, and even that will not feel long enough." He looked at her, the man who had stacked wood by her door and left an unsigned note and asked her once in a creek bed if he might be allowed to hold her hand, who had become everything, absolutely everything, and his eyes were full. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. Behind them the schoolhouse stood solid and real in the evening, the one she had built from the impossible beginning, the one with the straight blackboard and the proper stove, the one that was already too small again because Caldwell kept growing and Florence kept filling it, the one that held 12 years of chalk dust and pencil shavings and the slow accumulation of children who had learned things in that room that they would carry their whole lives, whether they knew it or not. Thomas and Margaret were home, she knew. Thomas would have helped with the evening chores and Margaret would have made a mess of the kitchen trying to assist with supper, as she always did with the enthusiastic incompetence of a 6-year-old who was absolutely certain of her own capabilities. The dogs would be on the porch. The lamp would be lit in the front window. Everything was where it was supposed to be, in the exact life Florence had come to Caldwell to find, the real and complete and astonishing life that had been waiting in all that wind and sky. She stood up and took his hand and pulled him to his feet, and they walked home together in the last of the September light, through the town that had once laughed at her arrival and had since grown accustomed to being improved by her presence. And the stars came out one by one above the Kansas prairie, and the air was cool and carried the smell of grass and approaching autumn. And Florence Bristol Donnelly, schoolteacher, wife, mother, woman of absolute and immovable conviction, walked through it all with her hand in her husband's hand, and her heart as full as the sky above her. Lily wrote to them that winter from Chicago with news that a publication in New York had accepted a story she had written, a long and detailed story about a girl growing up on the Kansas prairie with only her brother to look after her, and a teacher who refused to leave. And she said in her letter that it was not exactly their story and not exactly her story and was somehow both at once, and that she had dedicated it, quietly in her own private mind, to the two people who had made it possible for her to write it at all. Samuel read the letter aloud at the kitchen table, while Thomas ate his breakfast and Margaret climbed onto her father's knee for the portion of the reading that included descriptions of the Kansas prairie, which she had decided were about their prairie and not some imaginary one. Florence stood at the stove listening with her back to them, and she was smiling the whole time, smiling at the stove, at the morning, at the sound of Samuel's voice reading his sister's words, at the feeling of 12 years settling into 12 more ahead of them like the prairie itself, stretching out and out toward a horizon that was impossibly, beautifully far away. She turned to the table and looked at them, her family, the whole astonishing, unlikely, impossible collection of them, and Thomas looked up and caught her eye and said, "Mama, are you crying?" with the puzzled concern of a boy who had rarely seen it. "No," she said, firmly and completely inaccurately. "You are," Margaret announced. "I am happy," Florence said. "Those are entirely different things." Samuel looked at her across the table, over the children's heads, over the breakfast and the letter and the ordinary extraordinary morning. And the look between them was everything, was 12 years and everything before and everything after, was a man who had stacked wood in the dark and a woman who had walked toward a schoolhouse with 3 men laughing at her back, was the creek bed and the creek top and the winter social and the crooked blackboard, and a note folded inside a book, was a ranch built from nothing and a school built from determination and children who left better than they came, and a love that had started in a doorway in a rising wind and had grown, every single year, into something larger and more complete and more certain than either of them had known when they were young and beginning that any earthly thing could be. "More coffee," Florence said. "Please," Samuel said. And the morning went on and the land outside went on and the schoolhouse waited and the life was full.